And thank you for tuning in to the Sean Inspires podcast. I am Sean Allen, your podcast host and transformation life coach. Today, we have an amazing guest with us. His name is Andrew Alleman. He is actually, guys, listen to this, how amazing it is. He is the founder of podcastguest.com, and it is a service that connects podcasters with guests. And actually, over 30,000 people use podcast guests to have them on, but I really wanted to have Andrew on. He's a founder, he's the creator, he's like the heartbeat of podcasting and the whole podcast community. So welcome, Andrew, to the Sean Inspires podcast today. We're so glad to have you. So in your own words, just tell the audience today just a little bit about yourself and we'll go right into the interview.
Sure. I consider myself kind of a micro entrepreneur in the media space. So I've created a number of different media companies over the years. And the most recent one is the podcastguest.com platform that I started back in 2016 because I was having a problem finding guests for my own podcast and there wasn't a solution out there. So that kind of got me into it. And as you mentioned, now there are over 30,000 people using it.
Wow, absolutely amazing. And so you mentioned your podcast and having challenges to actually get people on the show and find guests to become, a part of a community, because now you have really built an amazing community of podcasters. And I am a recipient of that community. And so would you say your challenge was the springboard and inspiration for you starting Podcast Guests?
Absolutely. After I've been podcasting for about a year, I have a weekly podcast and I pretty much tap my Rolodex on people to invite to the show. And so I was looking around and I was like, well, what do I do next? How do I find people? Is there an easy way to do it? And the only easy way to do it at the time was to hire an agency, and they charge a lot of money to find guests for you. So I said, well, if I'm having this problem, presumably other people are having this problem too. And so I started reaching out to people saying, hey, if I create a platform like this, would you be interested in it? And a few people said yes. So I started it. And then, it really grew from there. And a lot of the growth now is organic. So I'm not sure how you found it, but, a lot of podcasters are looking for a way to find guests. Someone tells them about it, or they find it in Google or something like that. And so that's how it's been growing a lot lately.
And actually, that is how I found it. I found it out by word of mouth through another podcaster, and they asked me, had I heard of the podcastguest.com community? And I had not. I had no knowledge of it. And then after that, I went ahead and did some research and decided, why not join such a great platform? And the benefits of being a part of that community is amazing. And so we even may have some listeners on the air today that may be interested or have a curiosity to dig into or start their own podcast. So if you could, you've been doing it a long time, 2016. I started Sean Inspires in 2017, grassroots. So if you could share with the listening audience, what are some directives you could share with them on possibly how to get started and how they should build it? And what direction, basically, if they want to build a podcast, should they go with?
Sure. So, my first suggestion to people that are thinking about starting a podcast is to be a guest on a few shows first and see how you like that, because being a host of a podcast is a lot more work than being a guest generally. And so it'll give you kind of an idea, though. If you don't enjoy being a guest, you probably won't enjoy being a host either. But if you do take that plunge and like, I do want to start a podcast, my recommendation is to really just get out there and do it rather than trying to make everything perfect to start. You're going to learn a lot as you develop your podcast, as you grow your audience. They're going to tell you what they like, what they don't like. And so I spent a lot of time before I got started trying to get the perfect sound environment, trying to, get everything perfect before starting. And perfection can be the enemy of progress, right? And so a lot of people get out there.
Oh, I love that, Andrew. I love that. Can you say that again for the listening audience? I want them to grab that.
Perfection can be the enemy of progress. And so, if you spend 6 months just trying to get everything perfect before you even launch, you might not even launch. And we do find a lot of podcasters, even when they do launch, they don't stick with it because they realize it's a lot of work or it's not for them. And so I'd say just get something out there. If I were to suggest perfecting, if you will, a couple things before starting, or I not even perfecting, but spending some money on two things before you get starting. One would be a decent dynamic microphone, and the other would be your cover art, because the cover art for your podcast is it's like that you wouldn't put a lot of effort into writing a book, but then slap a bad cover on it. And it's similar with cover art. And this is what people see when they're scrolling through the podcast apps. And if it doesn't look professional, they're less likely to click on it and listen to it. So those are kind of the two things that I would do some upfront work on. But beyond that, yeah, just get it out there, and don't worry too. A lot of people think the podcast space is crowded. It's really not. In terms of the number of active podcasts out there, I see different numbers, but 300 to 700,000 seems like a pretty good range. And when you compare that to how many blogs are out there, how many YouTubers are out there, that sort of thing, it's actually a pretty small universe.
Yes, it is. And I was just reading an article that was released today on LinkedIn from the iHeartMedia podcast, and they released a little bit of forecasting in regards to where podcasting and the world of podcasting will go in the future. And not only that, but how much it has increased and how their listening audience of many different podcasts that they host, how the listening audience have increased in percentage. And so one of my questions to you is, a podcast is now going majorly across the globe, like streaming plus. Every network now is adding on a plus. So one of my questions, Andrew, would be, where do you see in your visionary scope, where do you see the world of podcasts possibly going into the next maybe 3 to 5 years?
Yeah, I think we've seen some interesting things. Podcasting to begin with, it was kind of like a publish once and then all platforms pick you up kind of thing. Whereas we've seen some changing now with Spotify in particular getting so deep into podcasting and doing an exclusive, for example, with Joe Rogan and some others, where we might start seeing this where, yeah, you've got to kind of like, you can only get, certain shows on Netflix and Apple Podcast or Apple TV and Hulu, that sort of thing. You might see something similar with podcasting. I really hope that's not the case, though. And I think for most people that are starting their own podcast, it's really a matter of getting it onto all platforms. I do think we're going to see some interesting things over the next couple of years as the world kind of reopens after COVID. So the interesting thing about the pandemic is we saw record numbers of people creating podcasts, but we also saw listenership kind of dip a little bit because people got out of their routines, listening to community or primary work. That all got thrown up in the air, right? And so then it kind of picked up again when people got into their new routines, but we're going to see a reshuffling of that again. We're going to see some changes here as people start going into a workplace again. I think this will be good for listenership. And we are also seeing fewer podcasts being created now than at the peak of the pandemic, kind of when everyone was moving online within the past year or two. So I think that's exciting for podcasters as far as, potentially a bigger audience and potentially less competition over the next couple of years.
Wow. Amazing. Amazing. I do believe that it is going to accelerate beyond what we as podcast hosts would have even possibly imagined. And so now that you have created this amazing community with over 30,000 members that are a part of it, what has been one of your highest joys of being the founder and the creator?
Oh, I love when I get messages from people that say things like, I was about to give up on my podcast because, I was having trouble finding guests, and now you just helped me book out my calendar for the next year, things like that. Or I hear from authors who say, I was launching my book, I wasn't getting much traction, and then I found podcastguest.com and was able to get booked on a lot of shows, and it helped, get traction for my book. So, especially a lot of people are out there spreading messages of joy and, improving mental health and that sort of thing. To be able to help people like that spread their message it's really rewarding. And so, it just lights my day up when I get emails like that from people thanking me for helping them do things. And ultimately, I'm just the platform. I've created the platform, and it's the people on it that are doing this, right? And so it's really exciting to see how that has developed.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're so glad that you did. I know personally, I have had many guests, even from the UK, several guests from the UK that I have connected with and built some amazing relationships with that have been guests and have decided that they would like to be returning guests on the show. So high five to you and all that you're continuing to do in and with it. We've seen so much happen in technology and how technology, even during COVID, there are so many businesses that had to do a lot of things virtually and shift the dynamic of day-to-day business operation, right? So what did you see happen in the realm of technology on how it possibly could have added some advancements for those that are podcast hosts?
Well, we've seen a lot of venture money come into the space over the past couple of years, and that money has gone to a couple of things. One is buying up shows, right, and putting them under a network label. But the other thing is the technology behind it. You know, we're recording this over Zoom, which is something that a couple of years ago, a few people used. And it's, you know, this is not a platform created for podcast recording, but there are 3 or 4 different platforms out there now that you can use to easily record podcasts and get really good sound quality. And it's just a lot easier, I would say, to start a podcast now than it was a few years ago. They're free and low cost hosting platforms. There's a lot of educational resources on the internet. And I think about it when I created my first website. I'm dating myself here, but it was in the late 90s. And back then it was so hard, right? There were if you wanted e-commerce functionality, you were talking about spending $100,000 to hire someone to custom make it, right? There were no payment gateways, weren't easy to set up. Domains were difficult to register. Hosting was expensive. And now if you want to start an online store, you just go to Shopify and you set it up in an hour, right? And so I think we're getting closer to that on podcasts, and that it can be overwhelming, right? You're like, okay, I need a sound setup. I need podcast cover art. I need a host. What's an RSS feed, right? So I can distribute this to all the different platforms out there. And I think it's going to get easier, which should help with that creation and getting more people to spread their word online through podcasts compared to other media.
And I would agree, because I know when I started my podcast by way of someone inspiring me to start it by some consulting information that I shared via text. And I had no knowledge. And you are correct. I was grassroots researching who should be my host, how to filter it to Apple for approval, being nervous and waiting, wondering if they were going to approve my content.
It was tricky.
So it is a lot that is involved in being a podcast host, as you have shared. And I'm so glad. That's why I wanted to have you on, because sometimes people have things in the back of their minds, and until it's unveiled to them in a way that is relatable and attainable, then it is only then that they feel like they can go ahead and accomplish it. And I love the way you have spoken to the audience today, Andrew, and shared very practical steps on how to go about building the platform. So we're going to shift just a little bit here. For those that are listening and are podcasters, I want to just dip into the whole monetization operation for podcasting. There are some that are really for it, and there are some that are really against it. I think it's a great avenue for those that want to gain additional residual income, correct? So what are your thoughts about the whole operation now that they've started to spread the opportunities for podcasters to monetize?
Yeah, it's an interesting subject, because I think a lot of people get into podcasting with a goal of getting a lot of listeners and then monetizing the podcast. And that's difficult, and it takes a lot of time. And so that's a frustration for people trying to grow their own podcast. It takes time, and it's kind of a chicken and an egg, right? You need an audience before you get advertisers, and you need advertisers to help grow your audience. And so there are platforms out there now that do make it easier to insert ads without working directly with the advertiser, which is helpful. But I would encourage people that are creating podcasts to think about what their goals are. And, monetizing it through ads might not be the appropriate goal for you. So some other reasons you want to start a podcast are, for example, to build relationships. With a podcast, if you reach out to someone and say, hey, I'd like to chat with you for 30 minutes to learn from you, they probably won't respond. But if you do that and say, hey, I'd love to introduce you to my podcast audience for 30 minutes so you can talk about yourself or your business, that sort of thing, then they're excited about it, right? And so that's a one-to-one relationship that you as the podcast publisher now has with someone else. I've also seen podcasters